Well, this is week number 5 of 7 weeks that we're planning to spend this fall in the book of Revelation. So I invite you to Revelation chapter 12 as we continue that study this morning. I thought we would begin by reviewing just a little bit about what we've seen so far. Revelation, we found, is basically about a great battle. A powerful force has come together and allied themselves against the people of God. Last Sunday, Ben showed us who's behind all of this. In chapter 12, we learned that it's the great red dragon. And Kristen, remind Dustin, it is a great red dragon who's behind all of this. It's a symbol in Revelation for Satan, because in the book, John uses figures and symbols to communicate his message. And so we have this terrible enemy. And he's brought to his side the Roman Empire that he's using as his henchmen to battle the people of God. And so we move on to chapter 13, and Rome is displayed as this terrible beast. And notice, this is in 13 and verse 7. Notice what this beast is doing. It was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So the power of the Roman Empire, backed by the devil, is making war with this ragtag group of disciples. From earth's perspective, ladies and gentlemen, it was a pretty bleak picture. What would the people of God do in a battle against the Roman Empire? From earth's perspective, it looked hopeless, which is one of the great things about the book of Revelation, because it is not written from earth's perspective. We get another side to this story. And so in Revelation chapter 4, we talked about this several weeks ago. We join John as he is invited to look through an open door into heaven. And we see this situation from heaven's perspective. God is still sitting on his throne, meaning he's still the one in charge. He's still running this show. And Revelation guarantees that not only does he know what's going on, but listen, he is going to do something about this. Chapter 6 in verse 12, God promises that judgment is coming. He says to his faithful saints, I will deal with your enemies. But Revelation also makes clear that would not happen immediately. And so are you looking in chapter 6? If not, go there. In chapter 6, we went through that chapter a few weeks ago as we looked at the whole picture of the book that's painted for us there. In chapter 6, down at verse number 9, John sees the souls of those who've been killed in this conflict. They're beneath the altar, and in verse 10, their blood is crying out for justice. And in verse 11, God responds to that cry. Do you remember what he says in Revelation 6 and verse 11 as he responds to them? The text says, and there was given to each one of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. What's he say? Judgment is coming, but it isn't going to be right now. You see, God's working out his plan. He will work out that plan in his time, which meant he wasn't going to bring judgment now, but instead judgment was coming in the future when he was ready in his time. And I'll tell you, brothers and sisters, those are easy words to say. That we've got to be patient and we've got to wait for God to work out his plan in his time. I want you to pause right there with me, right at chapter 6 and verse 11. And I want us to think a little bit this morning about what that reality meant for the people on the ground who were living through these awful times. When God says judgment is coming, but not yet. You will have to wait for it. What would that mean for them? More importantly, what would it require of them? And as we learn about that, what does it teach us as we live for the Lord and we wait for the coming day of judgment. I think what we're going to find this morning is that there is another side to the book of Revelation. Thus far, we've been looking what I think is the good side, the focus on victory and how God knows and God cares and He judges and deals with His enemies. And we like the parts about victory, but Revelation also paints a picture of what happens during that intervening time while we're waiting. It also paints a picture that tells us sometimes for disciples waiting for the Lord, there are harsh realities we encounter as we make our way through a hostile world. And so that's the thing that I want you to think with me about for a little while today. I want you to think with me about what it is like for disciples who are living in a hostile world, waiting for the Lord to bring His judgment. There are two hard realities I want you to see with me. We're going to begin with those people at that time who were told in chapter 6 and verse 11, wait, and then I'll bring my judgment. When God says wait, what did that mean for them? First of all, I want you to notice this. It meant that for a while, the disciples were going to suffer. In fact, I'll just tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the book of Revelation is straight up about that. In this intervening period, while they're waiting for the Lord, they were going to experience suffering. So I'm going back to chapter 2. Will you go there in your Bible? This is Revelation 2. Look down at verse number 10. We've talked already about the 7 letters in chapters 2 and 3. Look down at verse number 10. This is the letter to the church at Smyrna. He says, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison so that you will be tested and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Question, what was coming for these disciples as they continued living in a hostile world and waited for the judgment of God? What was reality? Well, Jesus said, you're going to suffer. You're going to be arrested and you're going to be thrown into prison. You will face tribulation. But it's worse than that, because now we're thinking about chapter 6 and verse 11, where he says at the end of verse 11, that there are more who are going to be killed. It isn't just about arrest and jail. Some of them are going to die. And we know why that's happening. Because we go back to chapter 12 and we look down at verse number 17 and we remember that Satan is making war with the people of God and that he's using the Roman Empire. And so in chapter 13 and verse 17, they're making war with the saints and they're overcoming them. Remember that the imagery symbolizes the historical reality. You had this crazy Roman emperor, Domitian, who took seriously this idea that he was a god and demanded that everybody worship him as a god. And there were the stiffest of penalties for those who would not go along with that. That was the reality that these disciples were living. They were hated and persecuted. They were seen as disloyal to the empire, and so they were subject to arrest and jail and beatings. And as we've seen, some were even killed. But understand that in chapter 6 in verse 11, when God says, I'm not bringing judgment yet. I'm not going to deal with your enemies yet. That's still to come. That what that meant was that these realities would continue, that they would continue to face tribulation and persecution. And some would die. I want you to appreciate with me this morning that that is not an unusual situation. What's happening in Revelation is not that odd. I go back to chapter 6, which we said earlier in this series displays the whole picture for us. If you remember chapter 6, in the first vision John sees there, he sees this white horse with a rider who is going out to conquer. And we describe that as a symbol for the gospel, going out into the world to conquer the hearts of men. But do you remember beginning at verse 3 in chapter 6, what's the very next picture John sees? The red horse. The one that comes and takes peace from the earth, the one that brings war. And we talked about that and how it symbolizes the conflict that inevitably follows the spread of the gospel. Where the gospel goes, conflict follows. Acts is the historical record of that reality. Read the book of Acts and you see this ebb and flow between conquest and conflict. So think about how Acts opens in chapter 2. We celebrate at the end of chapter 3 that on Pentecost, 3,000 3,000 souls responded to the gospel. And then we get to chapter 3, and there's another amazing miracle and more teaching going on. And man, it looks like this thing is just going to launch like a rocket, right? And then you get chapter 4. And the authorities come into the temple and they arrest Peter and John and they make threats. You don't preach anymore in the name of Jesus. And so you see, we have the victory and the success, the conquest of the gospel, and then the conflict follows. And you follow the book of Acts, folks, and it goes back and forth, just like that, all the way through the book. Where the gospel goes, conflict follows. Notice what happens to the people of God in the book of Acts. They are hated by their enemies. They are resisted and debated and argued with. And when that doesn't work, the authorities step in, and there are arrests and there are threats and there are beatings. And yes, in the book of Acts, some even died. You see, that hostile culture we encounter in the book of Revelation, biblically speaking, is hardly unusual. That's par for the course. That's been the way it's been from the very beginning of this. You know what is unusual? What you and I have been living in for the last couple of hundred years. I didn't mean to imply you're that old, Wesley. I was speaking generically. Where we live in a world where basically most everybody shares our same worldview. There's a God, Bible's the Word of God. There's a heaven and hell. We need to be trying to do what's right. A lot of folks haven't been trying to do it right real hard, but at least they believe those things. And moral values, at least in a broad sense, were essentially the same. That, ladies and gentlemen, is unusual. That's not the pattern, not the one we see biblically. But as we've also emphasized, that may well be changing. And the consequence of that is that we too may increasingly find ourselves living in a hostile world. You know, unbelievers are no longer content just to disagree with what we preach and teach. The things that we say in this pulpit about moral controversies, the things that you share with your friends and neighbor, there are some unbelievers today who want to label that not just as something they disagree with, but dangerous hate speech that needs to be criminalized and punished. That's where things are going. And if that is the way things continue, I am suspicious that what we're going to find ourselves in is back in a similar kind of pattern and circumstance that we see, well, in Acts and Revelation. It may be that for the people of God, the tide is turning, folks. And what we're going to find is a culture much more hostile to us, more opposition, maybe persecution, maybe suffering is in our future. In 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter said something to this crowd that I think we need to hear. This is 1 Peter 4 and verse 12. Are you there? He said, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of His glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or troublesome meddler, but if any of you suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name." Do you see it there? Ladies and gentlemen, our spiritual forefathers often passed through a fiery ordeal as they made the decision to walk with Jesus in the midst of a hostile culture. And it may be that you and I are going to be called upon to do exactly the same thing, to walk with Jesus in a hostile world. We need to expect that. We need to anticipate it, not let it come upon us as something that surprises us. It's one of the hard realities of living in a hostile world. God's people suffer. Now, let me ask you, if that is so, then at times like these, what does God expect from us? What did he expect of the people that he wrote this letter to back at the end of the first century? What was he expecting of the people addressed in the book of Revelation? That gets me to the second thing I want to talk about today. The second hard reality of living in a hostile world is this, that disciples must persevere. You will notice that is exactly what is demanded of the people of God in the book of Revelation. You do not get in this book and find that God says, oh, listen, folks, this thing with Domitian is terrible. This demand to worship him as a god and threatening your life if you don't do it. Listen, that's just awful, and I understand you guys are facing a terrible predicament. It's not just hurting you, and it's hurting your family, and it would just be too much to ask you to go through all of that. So listen, y'all want to go worship him and go along with all that, that's fine with me. I'll know you really didn't mean it. You realize the book doesn't say that because you laugh. The book says exactly the opposite. Will you go back to chapter 2? In verse 10, where we began this morning, Revelation 2. In verse 10, when he told the church at Smyrna what was coming for them, prison, testing, tribulation. What's the last thing in verse 10 say? In the face of that, what were they supposed to do? Be faithful until death, and I will give you a crown of life. We've already commented on that verse, right? It's often misquoted at funerals. Be faithful until death. This 107-year-old woman lived to be 107, and she was faithful until death, faithful all the way to the end. Well, you certainly need to do that, but that isn't what that verse is saying. That verse is saying, I need you to be faithful to me even if it means you have to die for me. That's what he's saying. And so in chapter 6 and verse 9, the martyrs are described as those who were slain because of the testimony which they maintained. Even in the face of vicious opposition, they weren't going to stop confessing that there is only one God to be worshiped, and he's on the throne in heaven, not on the throne in Rome. In chapter 12 and verse 11, those who overcome the devil, we are told, are those who did not love their life even when faced with death. In chapter 14 and verse 4, the faithful are those who are described as pure and who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And later in that chapter, in verse 12, as he begins to announce the fall of the enemies, John reminds the saints that this is why you persevere. This is why you hang in there and you remain faithful, because the enemies are going down. But do you see it? You got to persevere. In chapter 20 and verse 4, we see victory comes to those who do not give in even when you have to die. In fact, if you go all the way back to the beginning, in chapter 1 and verse 9, as John introduces himself to his audience, he said, I am your brother, your fellow partaker in the tribulation, in the kingdom, and in the perseverance which are in Christ Jesus. What do the people of God do when they're facing and suffering in a hostile world? Brothers and sisters, God's call was to stay with him and be faithful to him, whatever the price. And so, we have to answer that call. In our own generation, whatever my journey may bring for me, like the people in this book, my call is to follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Whatever obstacles arise, I stay with him. Whatever criticism and ridicule I receive, I maintain my testimony. Though admittedly, up to this time, it's been pretty easy for all of us to do that. I mean, we talk about struggling folks. We're not talking about the kind of struggling they were doing when they received this letter. When we talk about struggling, we talk about a guy struggling to overcome an addiction to internet pornography. Or we talk about a disciple struggling to forgive someone who they believe has treated them badly. And we struggle to overcome disappointment because financially speaking, life just hasn't quite worked out the way that I hoped that it would. And we struggle with fear of ridicule and criticism and persecution if we try to share the gospel with somebody. And we struggle greatly when our bodies are afflicted with injury or disease, and that begins to cause pain and maybe even put life itself at risk. And we just make a list like that of all the different kinds of things we struggle with, and it looks like a really bad list, doesn't it? Until you lay it beside people whose children and grandchildren were starving because they couldn't buy food. People who never knew when the authorities might come and haul them off before the image of the emperor and say, worship or a jail. What's your choice? Or you lay our problems up beside the disciples who sometimes were wrapped in animal skins and thrown into the arena and devoured by ravenous dogs. Entertainment for the crowd. And I tell you what, folks, I'm quite happy with whatever my struggles are. I don't want to trade places with those people. Do you? But the comparison does raise an important question. What happens when the persecution starts getting a little hotter around here? We've acknowledged that the culture is increasingly hostile. So as that happens, how will we respond? Let me ask you folks, what are we going to do when the government begins taxing churches because they will not comply with transgender bathroom policies? Can you not see that day coming? And guys, what are you going to do when the CEO of your company calls you in and says, listen, I'm just talking to all the guys in the company. I want to know where you stand on gay marriage because we're going to stand together as a company in favor of this. And you realize that your future, maybe your job is on the line. And if you think that's an extreme example, it's already happening to people. What if you showed up here this morning and 1,000 angry protesters were standing in front of this building rioting because of what we believe and what we teach, and you had to bring your family through that to get in here? And what if they start coming in? And they start taking people to jail? Or what if the time comes when the people in charge begin to put to death those who maintain their testimony? Unless that seems extreme, you know that's happening at places in the world today, folks. I'll tell you this, and it is very easy for me, standing in front of a supportive crowd in this very comfortable building. I don't know who set the thermostats today, but good for you. Sitting in this comfortable place with people that support you, it is very easy for me to stand up and say exactly what Peter said to Jesus before the cross. Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. But I tell you what, folks, here's the truth about that. Did you wear your steel-toed shoes this morning? Because here it comes. If a financial setback or a church fuss or a playoff game on Sunday night is enough to shake my commitment to Jesus, I'm not going to survive when a real storm comes. It's one of the hard realities of persecution, folks. You know what it does? It weeds out the uncommitted. I tell you, folks, if we're going to be serious about this, if we're going to survive living in a hostile world, then I've got to be serious about serving Jesus. No more of this half-hearted, show up Sunday morning and play church for a little while. I got to be all in. And so I think about the spirit of Paul. Last passage, this is in Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1. In verse 20, Paul says that it is his ambition that Christ will be exalted in his body, whether by life or by death. And then he adds this in verse 21. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Here's my challenge for all of us this morning. Can I say that about me? Can I say that about myself? That my life is summed up in one word, Christ. I am all in. I am completely committed to this. Will you do something this morning? Will you take a long, hard look on the inside and answer that question? And we all know the real answer. Whatever facade we are putting up today, we know the real answer. Are you all in? And if not, would you do something about that? We're getting ready to sing this song. And it's designed to stir you up and encourage you to fully give yourself to Jesus. So if we've got disciples sitting here today, and you realize I've been playing church on Sunday mornings, and it's time for me to get serious about serving Jesus because I won't be ready for the storm. Let's do that today. Maybe there's someone here that's never even chosen a side. You've not decided who you're with. Every day it gets harder and harder to stay in the middle. You need to pick a side. And the great thing about Revelation is we already know who wins. Why not be on his team, the winning team? Because in the end, God's people will be victorious. You want to be with them. If you need to make that decision today, we want to help you. Whatever your need, make your way to the front right now. Let's stand. Let's sing.